Well, welcome this morning. This is one of our Open Psychology Research Centre talks for students, and we're really pleased this morning to have Dr. Gemma Briggs, who is going to be speaking to us for 15-20 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for a question and answer session afterwards. And Gemma's an applied cognitive psychologist, and she's her work has very interesting and important practical consequences, as you'll hear, because she's interested in the dangers of multitasking when you're driving, and she's actually been very influential in terms of a recent national level policy to educate drivers not to use even to be aware of the dangers of using hands-free mobile technology. She'll explain all this shortly, and her talk is called Distraction and Focus: Why is Phone Use by Drivers a Problem? And she's going to be explaining about things like inattention blindness. So pay attention. Peter Hegarty is along with me. I'm Paul Stenner. We are the two co-directors of the Open Psychology Research Centre, the OPRC. Peter, do you want to say a couple of words about some of the practicalities about? I think probably. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so welcome everybody. Glad that you could be here. And thank you, Gemma, for coming on and doing this morning and sharing your work. It's going to be exciting. Gemma's got a lot to tell us, I think. Today the session will be recorded. So we'll let Gemma speak and do that. And then at the end of that, there will be opportunities for you to ask any questions that you have, and we would strongly encourage you to do that. So don't worry if your question is not completely fully formed, it's fine. There's no such thing as a bad question. We're just delighted to hear from you, and we want to know what you think. So you can do that in one of two ways. You can just put up your hand using the little icons, or if you'd prefer to, you can write your question into the chat and we'll see it there. And then Paul and I will kind of be the master of ceremonies, and we'll direct those questions to Gemma and that second half of the session. The only other thing to say, I think everybody on here has done this already, but just keep your own camera and your own microphone off while Gemma is speaking, because that just makes things a little bit more stable with the bandwidth and everything. So with that, I think we can turn off our cameras now and turn things over to you, Gemma. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Right, let me share my screen. Okay. I'm hoping you can see that. Oh, I've lost. There we are. Lovely. Great. Let me start this slideshow. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much for the intro and for welcoming me along today. So what I'd like to talk briefly about today is my area of research expertise and interest, which is driver distraction. As Paul said at the top, I'm an applied cognitive psychologist, so I'm really interested in things like eye movements and reaction times and things like that. But I'm also really interested in how we communicate these kind of empirical research findings to different audiences. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later on today as well. So as a starting point, I thought, let's make sure we're all at the same level of understanding in terms of what happens to your driving performance when you try to have a mobile phone conversation. And I say mobile phone conversation because most of my work is on phone conversation. But that's not to say that I can't answer questions or discuss anything about any other types of phone use behind the wheel. People often have questions about texting or live streaming or stuff like that. So from a baseline, if you use your mobile phone whilst driving, you are 4 times more likely to be involved in a crash, which is a pretty glaring statistic. I think it's been replicated time and time again on real roads in the lab, in simulators. So we're pretty clear that's the crash risk we're talking about. The follow-up finding for this is what got me interested in this study to start with, is that fourfold increased crash risk persists for around 5 minutes after your phone conversation has ended, suggesting we're talking about something cognitive. We're not necessarily talking about just manual or visual distraction. We're talking about cognitive distraction. Distracted drivers also show changes in their eye movements, and I'll give you some examples of that from my research shortly. They have reduced hazard detection ability. They're far less likely to notice hazards than undistracted drivers, and those hazards that they do notice, they take significantly longer to react to, which means they have longer stopping distances. They tend to have very poor lane discipline, and they make variable speed choices, and they will often fail to look in their mirrors or use their indicators to try and reduce the amount of things that they're trying to process at any one time. And no spoiler alert here, because you know that this is my area of interest, hands-free phone use. There is no benefit to using a hands-free kit over using a handheld mobile phone in terms of any of the effects on the screen here. So we're talking about quite a bleak situation, considering it's something of an everyday task that many people engage in. Now, underpinning all of these headline findings is a lot of robust empirical research, and I'm going to talk to you about some of that shortly. And I will, as a warning, mention a couple of cognitive models of attention, but I find the best way for people to understand some of these effects is to try to experience it for themselves. So in this next slide, I'd just like you to count the cars. So hopefully some of you will have experienced what is known as inattentional blindness. You're looking for something that's happening directly in front of your eyes, but you're not seeing everything that's occurring in front of your eyes. This is inattention blindness. And the reason is your mind is engaged in a cognitively demanding task, that counting task, which means certain attentional resources are drawn to that task in order to complete it successfully, to the detriment of those resources being available for other tasks. And therefore you can fail to notice things that happen right in front of your eyes. It works for around 40% of people in any given audience. And in all likelihood, if you're familiar with an example like this, you've seen perhaps the invisible gorilla example, you were looking for that change and you probably noticed that signpost. You're unlikely to have noticed the other two gradual changes because previous experience in a task like this doesn't affect the way that you distribute your attention across that scene in subsequent experiences, which I personally find fascinating. So this underpins all of my research in driver distraction, in the sense that distracted drivers suffer from inattentional blindness. The problem is they don't feel distracted, and maybe we'll have some time to discuss some of that later on. So this is underpinned by cognitive models of attention, and I warned you I was going to talk about some of these. I will make it brief. So if any of you have studied D200, you'll be very familiar with these, where I discussed this, some of this research in the module materials. But there's two different camps, so you can have a domain general explanation, the idea that we have a pool of cognitive resources that we dip into to attend to whatever task we're trying to complete. And we have numerous sensory inputs coming in, but there comes a point where only some of those sensory inputs are processed. So they reach this bottleneck in attention, either late or early on, and there's different theories as to at what point a selection is made as to what gets your precious attention. And the argument here is that overall increased cognitive workload will lead to decreased performance, particularly if you're doing two things at once. It makes a lot of empirical sense. But what I'm interested in is domain-specific explanations. So, you know, there's multiple theories. There's ideas that we have maybe more than one pool of attentional resources. Maybe we have a pool that can expand and contract dependent on task demands. But the idea is that if we want to complete two tasks at once, as long as they don't require common resources, the same resources, everything should be fine. So this theory here, multiple resource theory, that you can see at the bottom of the screen, is a point in case here. And it's a really kind of robust theory that's received a lot of support over the years. It's been around since the 1980s. So if we look at this, for example, we could say, okay, so two tasks should be fine if they require different modalities, different coding and different responses. So driving, a visual modality, you're looking to see what's happening in that driving situation. It's coded spatially in your brain and you have a manual response. A mobile phone conversation is an auditory modality. You hear the phone ring, you listen to what your conversation partner is saying. It's coded verbally and you respond verbally. So there's no overlap here. So either this model is wrong or the empirical findings that we've talked about in relation to distracted drivers are wrong, or something else is going on here. And we think it's the third thing. And that's what the research I'm going to talk to you about today has looked at. And we think mobile phone conversation has a visual element. And this is based on research and the kind of resistance to research, which says, well, hang on, having a hands-free mobile phone conversation is the same as talking to a passenger. It's not, because it's a question of shared environment. You've got someone in the vehicle with you, they can see what you can see, and they can reduce the demands they make on your attention. Whereas there's a lot of research that says when you're on the phone to someone, you create mental images of where they are, what they're describing, what they're up to. And the mental cognitive resources and the brain areas needed to create those mental images are the same resources and brain areas that are needed for accurate visual perception. So this is our competition for limited cognitive resources. There's a BBC Ideas film that I've made, you've got the link there on the screen, that explains all of that in a little bit more detail. So we did some research and we looked at drivers who were distracted by imagery-inducing conversation. And we found, lo and behold, compared to undistracted drivers, they were very, very poor at hazard detection. They were very unlikely to notice hazards. We tracked their eye movements. You can see the little yellow dot moving in the video on the screen. And we found that our distracted drivers had a particular problem with peripheral hazards, those at the side, often because they didn't look to those areas. Those hazards that they did notice, they took significantly longer to react to, which meant they had significantly longer stopping distances. So our distracted drivers, distracted by imagery-inducing conversation, were demonstrating inattentional blindness in the same way that some of you might have experienced in that example. They were looking directly at hazards, and we know they were because we were tracking their eye movements, but they weren't seeing them, they weren't reacting to them. If you look at the images at the bottom of the screen, the image in the middle to the left looks at the eye movement, the eye fixations of an undistracted driver compared on the right to a distracted driver. And what we found was our distracted drivers were demonstrating cognitive and visual tunneling. They were looking at an area of the driving scene 4 times smaller than our undistracted drivers. And even if we introduced a hazard where their eyes were pointing, they were very unlikely to notice it. So this hopefully demonstrates to you this theoretical underpinning. So we've got robust theory and we've used that to devise an experimental protocol and approach, and we've been able to explain not just that phone use is a problem because it's hard to do two things at once, but we've been able to explain it's a problem because it specifically draws on common cognitive resources that are needed for safe driving. So having 2 hands on the wheel and 2 eyes on the road isn't enough if your mind is also on a mobile phone conversation. In terms of sharing these findings, because the whole point of doing this research is to make a difference. I've been lucky enough to go and give evidence to the Transport Select Committee to talk about this. I did this a few years ago and got a really supportive report written by that select committee recommending a ban on all phone use, so banning hands-free phone use by drivers. Unfortunately, the government's response was that it would be a bit tricky and it would be difficult to enforce, and therefore that's not something that they can do at the moment, which is disappointing but unsurprising, and therefore we need to go for other ways of increasing public awareness and understanding, and I've been fortunate enough to do a lot of that. So you'll see just various pictures here. I've been interviewed lots of times on the radio, I've been on the news, we've written articles, I've worked with lots of different road safety charities, and we've created a project website, the Driving Change website. So there's lots of different resources out there, and the aim is to produce evidence-based education to increase public awareness, in the hope that in any absence of change into the law, we can look at changing driver attitudes and hopefully subsequent driver behaviour. So just very briefly, a couple of examples of things that we've done with these research findings, which you may find interesting to have a look at later on. So we've got some interactive activities that we've made on OpenLearn, which are based entirely on some of the research I've talked about today, where drivers can come along and they can experience their own distraction for themselves. And that's really important, because a whole other area of discussion in this driving arena is that most drivers consider themselves to be above average at driving, and therefore think, well, okay, I support mobile phone law, I sometimes break the law, but I'm better than most other drivers, so other drivers should obey the law, but not me. And that's a real problem. So when we devise education campaigns, safety campaigns, we need to target that in an understanding way, in the sense that 80% of the people looking at those campaigns don't consider themselves to be part of the problem, despite the fact that many of them are. So do have a look at some of these interactives if you're interested. And the idea is that they're kind of gamified, a bit of fun, but they put the driver in the position of not being able to say, yeah, but not me, because they're faced with their own kind of attentional limitations. And finally, the other thing that we've done is use this research to support the National Police Chiefs Council mobile phone enforcement campaign. And hopefully you'll recognise some of these things that we've created as being relevant to the research that I've talked about today. So using evidence-based information to communicate dangers, and importantly, not just telling drivers not to do it because it's not safe, or not just telling drivers that handheld mobile phone use is illegal and therefore they shouldn't do it. It's about taking the research evidence and sharing it in an appropriate, non-judgmental, meaningful way, in the hope that one day we can change driver behaviour. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. As ever, that was clear and really compelling. I'm going to be scared to do that OpenLearn resource, I tell you. I think we all around this and around so many things, I think we all do a lot of that, yeah, but not me, around psychology, don't we? Yeah. And how wonderful to have that there, so that people can not just learn about your research, but really engage it and really feel the phenomenon for themselves. I think you're absolutely right. I think that is so important. We have a small group of people today who have been listening to your talk, and I'm curious to hear if they have any comments or any reactions to it. So come on, do we have any people here who drive while they use their mobile phones? Anybody who's going to drive differently as a result of seeing this? Anybody got a spouse who does that you're always giving out to them about, and now you've got something to say to them? Anybody got any thoughts? And once again, you can write comments in the chat if you prefer to do that.
While people are coming up with their questions, do you mind if I ask a question? I was very struck by the point that you made, Gemma, about the specific importance of what I think you called imagery inducing conversations. And that, I think that's such a lovely expression. Can you say a little bit more about what's first of all, what sorts of conversations are likely to induce imagery, and also, you know, what is this imagery that's being induced? Because it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two answers to that. There's what is an experimentally imagery inducing conversation, and what is a naturally imagery inducing conversation. So I think what, generally speaking, we know from lots of previous research, not done by me in any stretch, but done by linguists, for example, or other psychologists, is that there is a human tendency for us to create images when we talk with someone who is not present with us. It's just something that happens. It's what's done. But in terms of the experimental approach, obviously we have to be more controlled, and we had to kind of amplify that. So when we did that study, we did there were multiple studies within that one paper. But the first thing we did was we gave people imagery inducing statements or non-imagery inducing statements, so that we can make this comparison to ensure that we had upped the imagery in that particular group. So we used some previously published research from a linguist with examples where the drivers had to respond, is this true or is this false? Things like, in a rowing boat, the rower sits with their back to the front of the boat, and you find yourself kind of looking up and to the left and picturing it. Cows have hanging ears, and you think, hang on. So all of the, you know, on a computer keyboard, the letter Q is on the left-hand side. All of these kind of things that, generally speaking, there'll always be exceptions, but generally speaking, you have to make that mental image. And that's the inducing effect, the imagery inducing effect. But yeah, we need to do more in that area, because I'm really interested in this imagery idea, and I'm really interested in more kind of naturally occurring imagery. But I could certainly see, if you think about the types of conversations people have behind the wheel, it's often, I'll be there in a minute, there's roadworks. So I'm sure that there will be mental maps of routes and things like that going on. Talking about where your conversation partner is, oh, I'm in the restaurant, I'm sat at the table by the door. All of those kind of things, I can see how it's a natural phenomenon. So yeah, we need to do some more. I hope that answers it.
Absolutely, yeah. We have a question from Merin. I think you are able to speak, Merin, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there, I hope you can hear me all right. I'm just wondering if there's any similarity in having a phone conversation with somebody on hands-free as listening to GPS directions, kind of telling me where to go. Does that also bring up imagery, or is it just because it's a one-sided thing that it isn't imagery? Just wondering if there's any similarities.
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot. I think, and in your question, you've touched on the answer there beautifully, because it's to do with the interaction. So yes, there certainly could be a case that people listening to directions on a GPS might have a mental map of where they're going. You could argue if they're using a GPS, they probably don't, and they're following the GPS for a reason. But the distinction is the interaction that's required. So, you know, a mobile phone conversation, you have to respond in a timely manner. And if you don't, your conversation partner is going to draw your attention back by saying, are you still there? Whereas a GPS sat nav, obviously, you don't need to respond. You need to take that information in and process it at a level that you understand that you're turning left at the next junction. But you don't need to respond in any other meaningful way. And so it's not drawing on your attentional resources in the same way. So people always ask about sat navs, and it makes complete sense. But I do think the distinction there is, yeah, the level of interactivity.
Thank you very much. That's definitely answered my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Merin. We have a question from Eka. Eka, go for it.
Hi. Thank you, Gemma. That was wonderful. Thank you. I came across this reading some time ago about cognitive and perceptual distraction. Is there any difference between the two, or is it two same things? Because it's really interesting to know more about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is the same thing. It's really interesting because within the area of cognitive psychology, we like to talk about attention in one box and perception in another and memory in another. But actually, you can't separate these things out at all. So because how we apply our attention affects what we perceive, and therefore the cognitive side of stuff is our attention, but that's also our memory, because we need our memory stores in order to focus our attention, in order to process information, and we bring, previous experience to every situation that we engage with, and that previous experience relies on memory. It affects how we apply our attention, and subsequently it affects what we perceive, literally what we perceive, to the extent that, as we've seen today, things can be right in front of you and you cannot see them. But equally, and even more interesting, I think, can affect, people can see stuff but understand it completely differently because of the experience that they've brought to that situation. So yeah, cognitive and perceptual things are very much intertwined.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Could I ask again, because I'm finding it so fascinating, and you alluded to some other research that you've done comparing conversations that people might have in a car. So there's, you're in a car and you're driving and there's somebody next to you and you're having with conversations that happen where the driver is clearly in the car, but the person on the other side of the mobile phone is at home in a completely different space and time in some ways. And if I understand rightly, you're suggesting that when the conversation happens in a car, to some extent there's an attunement between the two speakers that takes into account the fact that you're driving a car and you need to be looking at the road here. And so those conversations are in some ways safer than the conversations where one of the interlocutors is not privy to the fact that they're driving a heavy, dangerous mechanical thing down a road fast and so on. Is that right? And how does that work? It seems really interesting finding.
Yeah, it is. That is right. So it's very much the case of shared environment. So a passenger within a vehicle, I mean, there's also a selfish element. A passenger in the vehicle has a vested interest in their own survival, probably, and hopefully in the survival of the person that's driving them. So that shared environment, as you say, they know that they're distracting to some extent. We've all been brought up, don't distract the driver. We understand that, so implicitly. So there's that awareness. There's also the fact that, they moderate their attention, the demands they're making on the driver accordingly, but they will also at times help out. I'm terrible for this. I'm a terrible backseat driver. I'll say to my husband, have you seen this car? Come out on your inside. So trying to help in that driving task, whether or not they want that help is another thing. Whereas, as I said before, discussion with someone who's not physically present, they're going to keep demanding the attention. Now, I haven't specifically done this research, but there's a beautiful study that was done quite a while ago, which directly addressed this, and they did it. It was so clever. It's one of the ones I wished I'd have thought of. They compared phone conversation with, someone absent from the vehicle, live conversation with a passenger, and then in their third condition, they blindfolded their passenger.
Oh wow!
So essentially, it's not even necessarily the physical presence. The fact that the passenger in that condition couldn't see what the driver could see, and the effects were equivalent. Hands-free mobile phone conversation or a blindfolded passenger, far more damaging to the driver's attention than conversation with a seeing passenger. So yeah, it does seem to be quite a distinct thing.
That is really smart. Love it when people do that. We've got same people again, and Merrin, I think you had your hand up first. Can we hear from you?
Just a question.
Regarding exactly what you were just talking about, I just wonder how much of a distraction having a passenger in the car that isn't necessarily aware of what's going on can be to taking your attention away. So, for instance, screaming children fighting in the back seat, because they're obviously not going to be necessarily aware of what's going on around the car and what you need to be focusing on. So how does that impact the attention?
Yeah, it's a good question, and often equivalents like that are used as a, I'm not suggesting this is what you're doing, but used as a, yeah, but you know, it can't be that bad because we have screaming kids in the back of the car. So yes, of course, anything that takes the driver's attention away from that driving situation is a potential distraction. Particularly the idea of screaming kids is particularly pertinent because, as you say, they're unaware that they're, you know, affecting your focus. There's not really any kind of statistics on what that activity, if you want to call it an activity, means in terms of crash risk, simply because they don't, you know, you don't record these kind of things. It would go down as a, well, this is a driver error. But I think the distinction is, I mean, you can argue that people choose to pick up a mobile phone and have a hands-free phone conversation behind the wheel. I would argue that most of us don't choose for our children to scream in the back of the vehicle. But you know, it is something that very much happens, and those of us who are parents are very well aware that this happens, and it can be hugely distracting. I've been asked numerous times on radio, what would you advise? Which sounds awful. I don't want to give parenting advice to people. But you know, essentially, if you've got a screaming child in the back of the car and they really are affecting your ability to focus, then you need to stop and sort that child out, see what it is they need. So yes, there's all sorts of equivalents and all sorts of other distractors. But it's very interesting because that question is often framed by the media when I'm questioned on research as a, yeah, but, you know, almost like it's a race to the bottom. What, you know, what else is distracting? Well, we shouldn't stop using hands-free mobile phones because eating's distracting too. So yeah, it's a really important point.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I did think about it in that term, exactly in the way that you mentioned, that somebody would say, yes, but my kids scream in the car and I'm fine. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Great. We've got another variation which has been proposed by Ree in her question, who's saying, and this is an interesting one. You'll like this. Do you think that the imagery inducing effect that you discussed comes into play if, for example, a passenger is engaged in a mobile phone conversation? So
yeah,
it's
a really interesting question. I think there probably is an element of that, but and in fact, there was a master's student at Sussex when I was there way back when who was looking into that, and she didn't find any meaningful level of distraction on drivers in terms of passenger conversation. That's not to say that there isn't any, but the effects certainly weren't equivalent to the kind of, you know, fourfold increased crash risk that we know from direct conversation. And again, I think that comes back to interaction. Of course, it's distracting to have a passenger in your vehicle who might be inadvertently inducing imagery in you as a driver by you hearing half of the conversation. But I think because you're not physically engaged in that conversation yourself and you don't have the need to respond in a timely manner, I think that's probably less distracting, but definitely something that needs more research.
So you're sort of, that's very interesting. So you're sort of saying that the implicit demand in a conversation that you're involved in, which is that, you know, there will be a response from you and that you will pay attention, doesn't apply when that conversation is going on between the passenger and their interlocutor on the phone. And so it's easier to just dismiss that and concentrate on your driving.
I think so, and I think there's parallels with that with because another question I'm often asked about is, well, what about if you're listening to an audio book, you know, or a radio full play or something like that that induces imagery in the same way? And my answer there again is it's about engagement. But what drivers will tend to do is when they face something more challenging in that driving situation, they'll kind of block that other input out. I've certainly had that experience as a driver where I'm driving along, listening to a radio play or whatever. A challenging situation comes up. I deal with that challenging driving situation and then zone back in to the radio play and think, oh, what happened there? I've missed that completely. So we shift our attention there. And I think that's a whole area that we haven't talked about today, about how we process these things, because the assumption is that we kind of divide our attention between tasks, and a little bit of our attention goes to the phone task and a little bit to the drive, well, hopefully a bit more to the driving, but we don't. We know from research that we shift it, and then there's momentary gaps when we shift back where we don't process that information. So that kind of zoning out of listening to someone else's conversation or listening to a radio play is a prime example of that. You come back and you think, what's happened? But I figure it's more worryingly the other way around, when you zone back into your driving task and you think, oh, the car in front of me is braking and I need to react. So a whole other area of discussion, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. I could listen to you talk all day, Gemma. And I tell you what, I mean, there's three things I really like when I hear you talk. I mean, one is you just get all the excitement for the research, and you can really see the creativity in the experiments that you do and that other people do, and that comes across really clearly. And the second thing that I really like when you talk about this is, there can be a sense when you look at psychology, and particularly cognitive psychology, that things are in boxes and they're things, but you show us that that's just one way of making sense of it. And actually, really, we're talking about processes the whole time. Really complex processes are going on, and we can understand them as things, but they're really processes that are happening the whole time. And then the third thing is, you make me think about topics that are like to the side of what you're doing and think about them really differently. And today you've just really made me think again about conversations and what conversations are, and how strong the obligations are in conversation to attend to your partner, which is why it's different from listening to a radio play or anything else that you might do like that. So I think you've empowered us all to say, like, sorry, I didn't pick up your phone, I was driving. We need that politeness norm in the culture, don't we? Because we can have new politeness norms with new technology, and we really need that politeness norm in the culture.
We do. I hope that we'll get there one day. I think, but yeah, you're right. The politeness is a barrier as well. Aside from everything else.
Yeah. And, it's making me think of some other work in the school where people will do incredibly bad things for politeness. That comes up in the research project as well. Yeah.
But then there's all the other areas about, why do people, and this is what I've strayed more into recently, almost kind of the social aspect of it. Why do people feel they need to answer the phone? Why do they, and there's social norms and, younger drivers in particular. Well, I need to keep up. I don't want to miss out. Middle-aged drivers, my children might be in peril. I must answer the phone. So all of that comes into it as well. So motivations to resist the research findings, but also implicitly hugely understandable. You can see why people think this is something I should do and I get a real benefit out of it. And equally, you can see why people will say, well, you're not taking this away from me. This is my valuable time. I need to keep up and keep on this acceleration of society. So I just find it really, really interesting. Aside from the cognitive stuff is my jam. That's what I love. But I just find it really interesting for the implications.
I completely agree.
Like you study something that looks very small, but you find the whole world in it.
I think that's a beautiful way of expressing it. And so when you show us your research, you do invite us to make all of these really interesting connections. And I think it's not just that it's almost social psychology. It is psychology, and it's also touches upon phenomenology. So I love this expression that you used about putting people in a situation where you oblige them to experience their own capacity for distraction in a very first-hand way, and that you have a very clear sense that if you're going to educate people about these things. You have to give them a concrete experience of their own distractibility to distract them from being lured into saying, not me, you know, I'm too much of an expert driver, you know. So again, that's a very beautiful social intervention into how you interrupt and transform practices for the better. So I think it's very rich, very interesting research, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that you know, that your work has been so impactful.
Yeah. You've got a question in the chat, and Eka's hand is up as well. Which do you want to take first?
I thought I disabled that hand, but yeah, I mean, Gemma has already answered my question, which I had about passive listening. Cool. Because yeah, I wonder, as opposed to using mobile and interacting with your interlocutors in your car, whether passive listening would have any, you know, hazard risk rates. I mean, whether there is any less kind of risk rates to hazards as opposed to, you know, interacting actively with interlocutors, whether on the phone or on the. But you partly answered that question already.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it is to do with that interaction and that need to respond. In terms of, do we know how distracting it is? As a whole other talk. There's a massive problem with how we record contributory factors to incidents that police attend. So, you know, at the moment, we've got like 67% of all police attended incidents attributed to driver error, which isn't very meaningful, because within driver error, we could talk specifically about failures in visual perception and attention. So I would argue a lot of those at the moment could be explained by hands-free phone use, which is of course legal, and therefore it's not recorded. So in terms of things like passive listening, it's the kind of thing that might get noted down by an attending police officer, but there's no real meaningful data on the extent of the problem. I suspect it is a problem, and I suspect it is a contributory factor to some incidents, but I would argue probably nowhere near as much as that.
Yeah, you know, yeah. So I thought, thank you.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll draw to a close, because we've used up a lot of your precious time, and you've got a world to change. But this question is related to that. It's again, who says, this is fascinating. I agree. Out of interest, how do you plan on measuring the success of the campaigns and the literacy resources that you developed? How are you going to see if that's working or not?
That's a really good question, and I wish I had a conclusive, wonderful answer to it. It's really difficult is the answer, but that doesn't mean we haven't tried. So in terms of the police campaign, so the resources that I showed you at the end, we collect data on reach and significance. So we see how many people it's reached, and we try and survey some of them if they're keen to hear from us. So we'll contact them with a survey shortly after they've seen it, and again in a follow-up to say, you know, did you find this convincing? Did this present new information to you? Has this changed the way that you think? And then the follow-up needs to be, has this changed the way that you behave? So we've done some work in that area. In terms of the interactives on OpenLearn, we've got, again, survey questions at the end, and we ask people, are you happy for us to contact you again? So we've taken some measures, and we got some really interesting data out of that. So when around, I think it was around 5,000 people had completed it, we asked them just some rudimentary questions about, what did you know about research in this area? And around 34% of people who responded claimed to know nothing about the dangers of mobile phone use, handheld or hands-free, on driving, which, I mean, I know I'm in a bubble, but I was quite surprised by that. But equally, around 85% of people responded said, having engaged with those interactives, they will really limit their phone use behind the wheel. Not everyone was willing to commit to not using their phones. But, you know, so we take measures in those terms. But the other thing that we're doing is I've just helped to rewrite the feedback survey for speed awareness courses. So, you know, if you're caught speeding, you can be offered to go on a speed awareness course rather than taking fines and points. And these things are billed as, this is a great behaviour change approach. Education works, and you won't find me slamming education in any way, shape or form, but they didn't have any measures to show that it worked. They just implicitly said it works. So we've been doing some work for them in, you know, producing a validated scale to measure attitude and behaviour change for those attendees of the speed awareness course. And ultimately, I'd like them to reintroduce mobile phone offending courses in the view and the hope that we could do something similar there. So you have your education session, you find out people's views before that session, you find out their views immediately after, and then 3 months later now is what they'll do. They'll follow up and they'll say, what have you done in the last 3 months? How's your behaviour changed? You know, can you anonymously tell us whether or not you've been speeding? So yeah, I think that there's ways and means, but the answer is, unfortunately, there's no concrete measure. I've been asked before, how many lives has your research saved? And I like to say 42 because that's the meaning of life. But you know, it's really, really difficult to measure. So I think we just got to keep chipping away.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you to everybody who has come in for this session today. That has been a really lively, engaged session, informative, thought-provoking, slightly guilt-inducing, I have to say. But that's the best psychology, isn't it? So if you enjoyed this session, folks, please do tell your friends and your classmates about them. We'll be continuing these next year, so please do spread the word. And thank you once again, Gemma, from all of us for coming and sharing your expertise and your thoughts this morning.
Thanks for having me.